3, 2, 1, action.
This is Literary Roadhouse, one short story once a week. I'm Kenechi.
I'm Maya.
I'm Gerald.
And I'm Anais.
On today's show, we are discussing The Most Handsome Drowned Man in the World by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Literary Roadhouse is rated PG-13 for occasional potty mouth, but since the podcast is usually clean, we do rate each individual episode, so if you want to have your children listen, I highly recommend you check out the iTunes ratings on iTunes. I also have a couple of things I want to say. First, I want to thank all of our new Spreaker listeners. We had such a huge response on Spreaker, and I am so thankful for every single one of them. We are at about our halfway point for our follow goal, and hopefully we will appear on iHeartRadio in the next couple months. I want to thank each and every one of you, and I hope you enjoy the show. Also, I pulled... Are you guys hearing me okay, or am I breaking up?
Nope, you're fine.
You're fine.
Okay. I'll just cut that out. I also want to shout out all of our new international listeners. I was taking a look at the stats today and was absolutely shocked by just how many people from all over the world are listening to Literary Roadhouse. It makes me feel really good to know that we are spreading the word about short stories. We have listeners as far away as Sweden, Australia, Israel, Japan, Lebanon, and Kenya, as well as many other amazing countries that I can't actually name them all. Now, the one thing I want to say is each iTunes store is separate. So please make sure that you go to your iTunes store and rate the podcast so that other listeners in your country will be able to find us. It would help us a lot, and I really would like to see the family grow. We have so many people everywhere that I actually thought it might be kind of cool to have a map with pins for all the places where we have listeners. Lastly, Anais started a Literary Roadhouse Goodreads group. So head over there and introduce yourselves after the show.
And the Goodreads group is also a great place to share your thoughts regarding the stories that we read. You can also leave those comments directly on our website in the comments section to each episode, as Ellie did for last week's episode of The Old Man at the Bridge by Ernest Hemingway. Ellie wrote, "I actually quite enjoyed this, more so on the second and third readings than on the first. I thought Gerald's point about anonymity was spot on. The importance of knowing anything about the man is diminished by the time in which he exists. In so many ways, his identity is irrelevant, and through the war, all that he was and all that he has is lost, however nice it may be to learn a little more about him. Perhaps not the shiniest gem in the Hemingway crown, but still poignant and strangely touching for something without much character. Definitely one to look back at in a few months." And Maria, on the other hand, explored a different theme in the story and wrote, "I hated the story until I heard Kenechi's comments. Yes, it's a snapshot of an ordinary man in the middle of a war, the story of an ordinary man in extraordinary times. This is my first time reading Hemingway, and after reading the story twice, I felt, what's so great about Hemingway? After listening to the podcast, I realized what's so great about him is that in so few words, in such a simple story, he tackles one of the most profound issues we as human beings struggle with, finding our life's purpose. Before the war, the old man had a purpose. He took care of his animals. Because of the war, he can no longer care for his animals and keep them safe. This is the reason he doesn't move from the bridge. He has lost his life's purpose. He feels paralyzed. He has no real reason to go on, no reason to get off that bridge."
You know, when I read that comment, I got super excited, like super, super excited, because we touched on so many different themes in the story, but I don't think we really touched on purpose. And honestly, if I had caught that during my reading, I think my enjoyment of the story would have been much higher, which brings to the question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, did it really happen? If you put a theme in a story and nobody catches it, is it really there? And that's my question. Like, when I read it, it would totally, like, it didn't even dawn on me about the connection between purpose. But now that I've heard it, it seems so obvious. But if I didn't catch that in the beginning, like, how do I feel about the story?
And I like also hearing from listeners, because we're four people who usually get something different from the story, and still there's so many ways, almost an infinite number of ways to read it. The purpose thing didn't really occur to me either, and then I read it and I'm like, yeah, that's definitely there now that you say it.
Yeah, it was a great, great comment.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we should start with the story summary of The Most Handsome Man in the World, or The Handsomest Man in the World, depending on the translation you're reading. Kenechi, hit it.
Okay, so this story is about a small fishing village on the coast of an unnamed country in the Caribbean. And one day, a figure washes up on the shore while some children are playing, and it turns out to be a drowned man. And the story goes on to basically detail how the inhabitants of this town are affected by this drowned man's arrival. He doesn't have any indications of where he's from, so they kind of almost adopt him. They dress him up for his funeral, and they, I think in the end, they put him out to sea. But the story is really about the effect that this man has on the village.
How did everybody feel about the story? Why don't we start with Gerald? Gerald, how did you
I
feel about the story?
I would have put money on you coming to me first. I would have put my whole life on this. I knew you were going to ask me first.
I just want to know so bad.
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you there. Actually, because I read it a couple of times and I thought, yeah, I get it, and then I sort of looked at some reviews of it, and I thought it's magical realism, but so I should hate it, but it's
Yes!
I
Yes!
should
We
hate
have
it.
succeeded!
No,
We found a
because
magical realism story that Gerald gets!
no, because as we discussed, it has to have rules, and it had rules, and the rules didn't change, so it was okay.
I was so happy right now. I had a feeling you might like this one. I just had a feeling. Very stoked. How about you, Anais?
Listening to Gerald, I kept thinking, it's magical realism light for beginners. Like people who are
Anais
just learning to
tested, Gerald
appreciate it.
approved.
Yes. Well, I mean, 'cause I know exactly what Gerald's saying. It's not like all of a sudden the dead man came to life and was like, "You guys are totally right. My name is Esteban." He stayed dead. Like, and he was like, sir, there are some rules that were stuck to, and then the only thing that ran wild was people's imaginations, and that's a lot of fun. And that's one of the reasons why I like the story so much as well, is because everything that you were seeing that was so vivid up until the end, but almost everything you were seeing was in everyone's imaginations. Because the story, when it starts out, the village is bland, and then all of a sudden it just comes to life because of people playing. That's what I liked about it. It was a whole village playing together.
I love this story on like every single level. The first thing, normally when I read a translation of anything, like there's extraneous words, it doesn't necessarily flow. Whoever did the translation did a really good job. At least the translation we read was flawless. It was smooth. There was no extraneous words. There was wordplay in there that I'm assuming was gained from the original Spanish, because it had like a Spanish flair, but it was in English, but I got it, and it was beautifully done. So the translation was wonderful. But then there was nothing extraneous about the story. It was like the perfect example to me of how eventually when I'm a great master, I would love to read one of my short stories and say, there's nothing here that can be cut. And that's how I felt about the story. There was nothing that didn't belong there, and it was just so elegant and beautiful. And then the other thing I loved was there was this question, is he really bigger? Is he really like a giant? Is he not? Is this like a Gulliver's Travel, or is this a big black guy? There was this vaguety to it, so it was magical realism, but again, like you said, magical realism light, and it didn't push my senses to the point where it no longer felt real, and because of that, I was able to really visualize it, and I felt like I was in the village. And I got those people, and it was beautiful watching the effects on them and how it was almost a religious experience for them. Oh, I so love this story.
Yeah, I also like the story a lot. I liked I think for me personally, and I feel weird saying this, but the use of language was perfect, and it's weird because it's a translated story. So I mean, I don't even know if that's exactly how the story was written in Spanish, but I think nonetheless it was perfect. The wordplay and just the way the whole story was described. And I think part of the reason why the magic realism works so well is because the location of the story is unknown and the people are unknown. So even before you start reading the story, there's kind of this mystery of it, and just the whole mystery of something being washed up on shore. Like the sea. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read Moby Dick, but that book starts with paragraphs upon paragraphs about how mysterious the sea is. And so the sea is washed up, this thing, and when it's first washed up, they don't even know it's a person. Then they discover it's a person, and then it goes from there. So I think like that whole aspect of mystery kind of facilitates the magic realism, and it allows you to believe in things that you wouldn't necessarily believe if we were given an explicit description of things.
Yeah. Now we have a problem because we all like the story. That's a problem. So I have to ask each and every one of you, was there anything about the story that you didn't like or that you didn't get in some way?
No.
Well, there is one thing that I didn't get, but I feel like we're almost like jumping ahead in the conversation because we haven't really built up how the dead man, comes. But if you've read the story, and I'm guessing a lot of our listeners have, so when the women first start making up stories about the dead man, he's something to be idolized. He's like completely perfect, that everyone wants to be with him to the point where like they hate their actual husbands because this drowned man,
which was hysterically funny.
Yeah. But then, I don't understand quite why. There's many ways that story could have continued, and it swings into a like, oh, poor Esteban, he's so big, he's kind of goofy, and his life was so hard, and he broke every chair. Like, how did that swing happen? Wasn't very clear to me, or why.
Yeah. Good question.
That's a good question.
Did anyone have any thoughts?
No, I noticed. I
like there is a change there in the story, but it was done so slowly. I just changed right along with it. For me, it was like, for me, it was the natural, when you see a celebrity, you idolize them, you don't see anything wrong with them, you think their life must be perfect, and then they have their third DUI, and you're like, wow, their life may not be perfect, and then you start to see like the shell come off. As they're like scraping his face and everything, they're seeing the real man underneath, and he looks sad, and he's been in the water for too long, and he's swollen. For me, that's why I was able to go with that. But you're right, it is pretty abrupt. It happens pretty quickly. But I felt like, there was a change there, especially because it happened during the same time period that they were scraping off all the plaques and everything from the water, from being underwater for so long. I definitely just went with it.
And the one thing I did notice is that when it happens, it's when, so remember when most of the women, especially the old women, decide, oh, his name must be Esteban. And then it's the younger women like, no, he's a Lautaro. They're like trying to give him a different name. And then it's kind of like, they decide like, oh wait, no, he's goofy. Okay, fine, he can be Esteban. It's almost like the change happened so that the younger women could agree with naming him Esteban. Like it almost happens for that reason. Like, okay, we're arguing about his name,
well,
so I guess.
What Esteban was, right? Like when I did research on the story, it's been proposed that he's referring to the Esteban who was the explorer in the 1500s, and the other name that you stated was an explorer about 20 years after him. And Esteban was a runaway slave. No, he was a slave who helped lead an expedition into what would be, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, when the Spanish were exploring, and he was killed by a bunch of Native Americans. And he was black, and he would have been larger than the native population in the villages where this story would have taken place. And after he was killed, the natives that killed him actually they idolized him in certain ways, and there are parts in South America where Esteban is it's like a metaphor for, I don't know, like he's more than a man. He spoke 14 languages, and he traveled all these unique places, and he was looked at as something to idolize, and which made sense to me for when they scrape off his plaques and they see his face, and then it is Esteban. To me, that was scraping it off and realizing it's a larger black man. Well, it would have to be Esteban because that's the only representation of a black man they would have seen it until that point. And so that's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, I was just looking back at the story because I have it open in another window, and they said because they're sewing him some clothes, and it said while they sewed seated in a circle, blah, 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 blah. It appeared to them that the wind had never been so sustained, nor had the Caribbean been so unsettled as on that night. So, and they supposed that these changes had something to do with the dead man. So all of a sudden, it had gone while they were working. The atmosphere on the land had changed, and the weather had changed slightly, and later on it said when they were sort of dreaming about this guy, and just before the one who's called Esteban, it says the oldest of the women who, by being the oldest, had contemplated the drowned man with less passion than compassion sighed. So it's as if, because the thing I picked up was that the men had a very, very different attitude to him than the women, and they felt, I'm sure they felt belittled by this huge guy that was seemed to be every woman's dream or something, apart from being dead, and so the men in the village, they just wanted to get rid of him quickly, and
until they saw his face as well, and then they were like, "Oh, it's Esteban."
Yeah.
And Esteban, like, he was considered like a sign of the heralding of the white man coming. So yeah, it would have. I see this as like a metaphor of change and religious experience and renewal and all of that. And I have so many emotions around the story. I'm having a hard time putting them into words because it just touched me on so many different levels all at once. Like, I read it as an experience. Does that make any sense?
Don't know. What do you mean by experience?
Well, when I first read it, instead of reading it and feeling like I was reading a story, like in a very logical way, as I read it, it almost read like an emotional experience to me as I was reading it. I got that deeply embedded in the story. And that's something that doesn't happen to me very often, and it was something I really appreciated and found beautiful about this story.
Yeah,
I think that's to do with the way that it's written, because I think even the style of this story, it's very similar to a lot of his other work. And if you notice, like, despite the fact that there's actually dialogue, there's no, like, the whole thing is just prose. Like, he doesn't stop to put dialogue separate. The whole thing is just prose. Even when they imagine Esteban's thoughts, it's just bang smack in the middle of the prose. So I think that's like one of his aims when he wrote the story, like, to just keep the reader engaged the whole time.
Yeah.
And going back to something Kenechi was saying a little bit earlier when he was talking about, so Kenechi was saying he likes the descriptions, and I don't know if you used the word sort of indirect, but I felt like the world building, it was like oblique clues. He never came out and said, for example, oh, there's less than 100 men in this village. Instead, he says that all the men fit in 7 boats so that when they found the drowned man, they had only to look at the other to realize that they were all accounted for. So like it's in this way where he constantly keeps you seeing things in your mind and then giving you all these clues about everything around you without ever just sort of saying, and it's a tiny village. It's a part of what's going on as the plot moves forward, which made me think a little bit then, since we just read Hemingway last week, when Hemingway said, prose is architecture, not interior decoration. It's one of Hemingway's like famous quotes. And I felt like that was certainly true in this story, where all of the prose was just sort of moving this thing forward instead of stopping to look at something. It never really did. It just kept going.
Yeah.
And I noticed when they were throwing him out to sea or burying him at sea, and there was a section right at the end about them gathering flowers from the other villages, and I thought, why from other villages? And it's only when I went back and read it another time that I realised there's a thing when he's describing the village and he just mentions flowerless stone porches, and I thought, wow, it's there, but it's you can miss on these little details, but it's somewhere at the back of your mind because you've read it and it's sitting there, and you have this picture. I mean, he's right. You've got this picture built up. But the fact that it was flowerless didn't really come out until you see them going to other villages to get flowers.
And I also noticed with the flowers thing, first the village is flowerless, then the women are putting flowers on his body, then there's flowers coming in from other villages, and then at the end of it, they're dreaming of a future where there's flowers growing in the village. So it seems like the more and more the Esteban mythology that they invent together takes hold, it's like the village, which was this dry, boring, deserted place, which seems very isolated, is like breaking free of that. No longer isolated, no longer boring, colorful. So to me, like, there was this thing of sort of like what happens when you just throw something that kind of like sparks life in something else.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's why it felt so much like they were having a religious experience, because it started out so barren and so dry, and the dirt's so hard packed that nothing grows, and they have to throw their dead off the cliff because they can't dig holes, like into some place where they're going to build bigger houses with higher roofs and bigger doors, and they're going to have flowers. Like, it was so beautiful. So, so beautiful. I'm definitely going to be reading more of this author. Kenechi, have you read any of his novels or just his short stories?
Yeah, I've read I think, two of his novels. 100 Years in Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. And I was going to say one thing I like about him particularly is how his narrators are almost like characters despite the fact that they're not. But the way in which he tells his stories, the narrators don't know everything, and it's clear from the way they narrate. So it's like, it's as if the narrator's telling you a tale that the narrator heard sometime, rather than the narrator being, omniscient and giving us all the details. It's like the narrator doesn't even know the details. So even within this story, it's like when they established that Esteban was his name, the narrator didn't say that it was. He said that it was clear that it was, if that makes sense. So it wasn't like something that the narrator decreed. It was something that the narrator took as a fact, rather than creating the fact, if that makes sense.
That's really interesting. How do you feel his short stories compared to his novels?
I think his novels, in particular, the novels I've read, they're exactly like this. I mean, in terms of the way they're written, and in terms of the way the language flows, they're exactly like this. They're just a lot more layers, because obviously they're novels. So you would have like little maybe snippets of his novels that read exactly like this, but then it would go on, and you'd have obviously more depth and more detail because of it is a novel, and you'd have, by that point in time, you'd have had more information about the characters and so on. But I mean, if you like this, I'll definitely recommend reading his novel, in particular 100 Years of Solitude, because this short story reminds me a lot of that.
It's great.
So I haven't read the novels. So Kenechi, do you think this takes place in that fictional village? Because I've heard that he has a fictional village named Macanto. No,
it doesn't, because that wasn't by the coast. I mean, I think at one point it was by the coast, because in one of the stories they found a ship in the middle of the forest, which is really weird. But so I don't know. But this village isn't the same as that village. That village is, like, from the description you can tell it's two different villages.
Okay.
But I mean, that village is like the description he describes. It's hard to explain, but his novels are written exactly like this, like how you get the feel for the characters, the feel for the scenery, the feel for just like the mood of like the whole village and the whole town. Like, it's exactly the same in his novels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really excited to read one of his novels.
I will say that his novels do have a lot more magic realism though, but it doesn't jar you so much, because he just weaves it straight into the storyline, and it's like, yeah, I mean, it's believable.
In other words, Gerald should read a few more of his short stories before.
I think, yeah, possibly.
I think he's ready.
He's his way in.
Ready.
You're making fun of me.
Just a little bit. Only because we love you.
I'll forgive you.
Well, since we were talking about the village a little bit, after the second read-through, it occurred to me that the village is kind of like the main character, because that's really what changes is the whole village. The biggest arc, if you want to look for like a change, the village is the one that went from boring, isolated to all of a sudden kind of like breaking free. And I feel like such a cliche, because whenever there's like a book review of like, not that he did that, for me to say that the village, that the setting is a character, because whenever there's like a book, the best thing a book critic could do is say, oh, I felt like he made New York City another character in the book, right? But in this one, it's really true, because it isn't just that the village has character, it's that the village changes the way a character would change throughout the course of the plot.
Yeah, and I actually think that's why I enjoyed this story so much more than last week's story, because there was a character that had an arc, and I felt like there was an actual beginning, there was a middle, there was an end, like something changed. Whereas when I read last week's story by Hemingway, I never got that sense. Remember how I said I didn't care who it was, but if there wasn't going to be a story, I needed a character, just somebody to latch onto. And in this story, you're right. I felt like I was latched on to the village. And that was the character. That's where the arc was. And that's what kept me cemented in the story and allowed me to go with it and fully enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I love the fact that the thing that creates this change in the village is a dead man. There's no character there. There's no, he doesn't say anything. He doesn't do anything, but his presence on the beach changes the village, and that's a fantastic thing to do, really. That he doesn't. There's a non-character affecting the change in the other character, i.e. the village.
I also love that it was the children that discovered him first. That the children were playing with the body before they realized it was a body. There's something about children's innocence and their openness and how they see the world that was very symbolic to me, that the children would be the first one to spot him.
I think it's also interesting that the children weren't affected by him. I mean, at first they thought he was an enemy ship, and then, they just started playing with him. Like, all the stuff that happens to the grown-ups, none of that happened to them.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
I think I kind of get the feeling from the story that the man is, I don't want to say cursed, but it's like some kind of magical effect that doesn't work on kids. And I feel that way because I feel like the man could have almost been anything, because the story isn't really about the man. It's more about the villagers and the locals' reaction to the man. So it could have easily been, a giant statue that washed up, and then they all start projecting their own thoughts and feelings onto the statue. And I think also, like, choice of words later on in the story, and particularly when he talks about somebody who was on the ships and they thought that they heard a siren, and the sirens are from the Greek mythology that sing, and people crash their boats into the rocks. So I feel like there was a hint of that in the story.
Yeah.
How about you two?
Yeah, I think the children thing, it could also be that children just accept things. They have no preconceived notions. There's this thing washed up on the beach, so they play with it. Of course they do. It doesn't mean anything to them. So it's only the adults to whom this dead body begins to take almost come to life in a way that it affects how they react and affects also the village.
It's funny because I'm reading the children thing completely different from the rest of you. So that's, interesting that we can get that way. Because when I saw that the children just started playing with the body, I didn't think, oh, kids are so open, how nice. I was like, that's really weird. Like, even for kids to play. Because at that point, they already knew it was a dead body. I mean, maybe I was just a very neurotic child, but I would not have been cool with that. And
did
there was
they
a part of
already
me that
know?
went, they did. Because remember, it was like they saw the shape coming from the horizon. They thought it was an enemy ship, then they thought it was something else, and then finally they realized it was the drowned man. And then later the adults find the kids playing with the cadaver, right? That's really weird to me, because even kids are not that open that they're going to play with a corpse. So for me it was more like, because it's almost like that mirrors what the adults do for me as well, because the adults also play with the body. Because like at first it's very clinical. At first it's just the women are like undressing him because that's what you're supposed to do. But as they're undressing him, they're creating whole stories about him. Like there's that line where it's like, they notice the vegetation, which is very clinical, was from far off seas and deep waters. There's the play beginning, right? And that his clothes were in tatters, which is clinical again, as if he had navigated through mazes of coral. There's a million reasons why his clothes can be in tatters, but even the adults start playing. So like for me, it was almost as if it was part of the world building for me, because it showed that this village was so boring and so starved that you get a dead corpse and it isn't even just like, well, let's do right by him and bury him. It's like, oh, there's this whole mythology that's created around it, which is what I said at the beginning with, I like that this seemed to be exploring for me two things: play a little bit as escapism, escaping how boring everything is, and also play as sort of like, because that game ultimately does propel the whole village forward. They start having dreams they didn't have before for a future with flowers, right? So a little bit as play as work, play as motivation and ambition. So yeah, that's kind of the way that I read the kid part.
I read it completely different from all three of you. I read it that what does the man bring? At the end, he's brought an experience that gives them joy and hope and a new way of seeing the world. He's given them hope. And that's something that children, unless they've been abused, usually already have. And so for the children, they wouldn't have been as dramatically changed because they haven't lost that yet, whereas the adults have. And so I saw them playing with the corpses, them playing because that's what they would do because they're kids, but also because rather than it being a dead man, it's hope and it's change and it's renewal, and that's something that children are already comfortable with. And so that's just how I read it. It's interesting that all of us, pretty much read it a little bit differently, but you're right, it was kind of creepy.
Yeah. No, and
here's another fight, let's play with it.
Yeah, and it's funny because I hear you say that, and I'm nodding along like, yeah, that's a fair interpretation too. Like, there's so many ways you can take it, and all of them, have evidence or are valid.
And it's
an interesting story.
You say that the kids are playing with him, and then the women later are also they're dressing him up. It's almost like a doll. It's this dead man, so they're dressing him up with these clothes that don't fit him properly. So they're sort of mirroring what the kids were doing early in the story too.
Yeah. So interesting. So interesting. So should we rate this story?
Yeah.
Let's have at it. Who's gonna go first? Who's on first?
I'll
go first. Okay, you go first.
Yeah, I'll give this story a 5. And just because I didn't find any faults with it, like I thought it was really good. Language was good, and from a short story, it gives you everything that you'd want from a short story. Draws you in, tells you a story,
so
and
why
then
a 5 and not a 6?
Because 6 to me is perfection, and that's.
But you just said there was nothing wrong with it.
Doesn't mean it's perfect, though.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
Yeah, I'll give it a 5. I don't know. When I read a short story and it's like it changed my life, then I'll give it a 6. But before then, it's 5.
That's a pretty high standard.
I agree with Kenechi. I'll give it a 5 too.
Gerald just gave a magical realism story a 5. Mark this one down in the history books.
Can we come back? I do have a question after you finish marking, so come back to me.
Okay. I'm going to give it a 5.5. Again, I was really close to giving it a 6. I love this story so much. I really love this story so much. I'm really thankful that we got to read it.
And it's a 4.5 for me. I think I have the thing Kenechi warned us about in the very beginning when we came up with the rating system. It was like, but now I need to remember what I give 5s to and 6s to. So, I mean, there's some stuff I gave 5s to where I think I walked away from it feeling a little bit more affected. I really liked the story. I thought it was really competent. I thought it was really good. I enjoyed it every step of the way. But I didn't walk away from it feeling like, it's not a book. It's not the kind of short story where I turn around and I say to my friends, you need to read this. So I think that's kind of, which shaves off.
So you said 4.5?
4.5.
Or 4, yeah.
4.5.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the sky opened up and the harps played for me, so,
Yeah.
One thing I will say is that with Garcia Marquez, I read one of his short story anthologies, and it's just really easy reading. I mean, you don't necessarily get the feeling to go and tell other people, oh, they should read this, but every short story, you read it, and, like, you're happy you've read it, and then you walk away and you think, oh, that's a good short story. And so it's like, I feel like the whole anthology itself is just a good read, and I would recommend that read. I can't remember which one it was I read though.
Now, what
But
was it that you had a question on, Gerald?
Yeah. So what makes it magical realism? Answer me that.
Riddle me this.
Yeah. I think I heard something. I can't remember the exact example that they used, but it was something to the effect of like, if all of a sudden everyone has like, was this an author quote? It's like if they have a talking monkey on their head, if it's science fiction or fantasy, you need an explanation for why there's talking monkeys in everybody's head. And in magical realism, everyone starts acting as if there's always been talking monkeys on everybody's heads. So it's sort of like as soon as something weird happens, it's as if it was always there. That's just how it always was.
I think the question, though, is what is the weird thing that happened? Because a body can wash on shore. For me, it was because the man was much bigger than a normal man. The amount of men it took to carry him and how difficult it was to get him in the house. It was such like a big part of the story that I saw this as more than just, somebody that's 6 feet tall. I saw this, a significantly large man, like a small giant. And I think that's part of what makes it magical realism. I also think what makes it magical realism is the religious experience is accepted and it's not questioned. It's not looked at objectively. They don't say, what is this that we're experiencing, like you would get in like a regular story where someone has a religious experience. It was accepted in a way that felt really natural and of course. And I think that's what Anais was saying, where you have the magical monkey on your head, and you don't say, why is there a magical monkey on my head? You say, there's a magical monkey on my head, and it's always been a magical monkey on my head. And I felt like that was probably why it was classified as magical realism. But you're right, it was really subtle. And I questioned it a couple times myself, wondering, is this really magical realism? But the size of the man was such a big part of the story that I don't see it as just like a normally tall man. Like they saw him as an idol, as a god, as something extra. And I think that's what makes it magical realism. How about you, Kenechi? You got any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, as I said before, I think the fact of the amount of mystery that's left up to the to the story, like the settings of the story, it kind of lulls you into the sense that the size of the man was something normal. So it's kind of like Marquez has played a trick on us, because if he had told the story like he said, okay, specifically this is this is a city in Panama, and these are the names of these people, and this man is 7 foot, he's 10 foot tall and whatnot, then you'd be like, okay, these are really strange things. But the way he didn't really specify, it's like he kind of just made the magic realism so subtle that we're even questioning if that's what it actually is. But I agree with you. I mean, the guy obviously was huge, and the fact they said at the start they described him as, it felt as if the water had seeped into his bones, because that's how heavy he was. That's not something that's normal, but it seems normal within the context of the story.
I like how subtle it was. I really enjoyed it in a way that I haven't enjoyed any other magical realism. I came into this podcast really new to magical realism and unsure if I would like it. And I've liked the other stories, but this is the first one that I've read that I loved. And I think part of the reason why I loved it is because it didn't beat me over the head with it. It was very subtle, and it felt very magical in the way it was done.
Yeah, it's kind of like sci-fi being near future sci-fi. It's sort of there's more realism than magic, which certainly pleases me.
Yeah.
But but it's funny that you say that, because I was just thinking, if this was a sci-fi story and this giant man washes up, all of a sudden is there an island out there with giant people? Is this an alien race, right? Immediately what happens is the hunt for the answer, while here there's no hunt for the answer as to why he's big, right? Yeah. That's the key that I think is magical.
Mm-hmm. That was a very good point, Anais. Very, very good point. So we have an announcement for next week that is going to affect how we play our game this week. The announcement is that we're going to have a guest next week because Anais will be on vacation, and we're very excited about this guest. Should I announce the name?
Yes.
Or should I save it? Jo- Jocelyn Johnson is going to be our guest co-host for next week's episode. She was the woman that wrote The Hasselblad, and we're very excited to have her on the show. I think she's going to be a great fit. And because she's a guest, we have let her choose the story for next week. So what is next week's story?
Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor.
That's pretty cool. I literally just saw his name on something, and you guys chose the same story. It was kind of crazy. Like, mind meld there. And what did we get for Bradbury's for last week?
Last week we discussed The Old Man at the Bridge by Ernest Hemingway, and listeners gave that story a 4.
That's pretty awesome.
Please leave more Bradbury's.
Yes, we need more Bradbury's.
Yes.
And Kenechi, I think we're still going to play the game. I'm going to have to cut out all these intros because we got to keep it going. Too much dead space.
Okay. The game is the most commonly used words in the English language, top 100. I've got it up here on the website, so how we'll do it is we'll just cycle through and each person will just name a word until someone names a word that isn't in the list, and then they get ejected from the game. So last man or woman standing wins.
Okay, so let me get this straight. We're all picking words that we think are the most used words in the English language, and the first person to not get one is out.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Okay.
I have a question. Are we counting stuff like the, and?
Yeah, everything.
Okay. Oh, all right.
Let's go for it.
So let's go in the order of Maya, Gerald, and Anais.
The.
Yeah.
And
Wait, hold on. I didn't say start yet. Wait.
Oh.
All right, go.
I already said the.
All right, cool. Gerald?
and
He,
Wait, hold on. Sorry, hold on. Yeah, go on.
he,
She.
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
but, the conjunction.
Can.
um, um, have.
Oh, you got this.
Yeah, have. Have is number 9, surprisingly.
Really? Oh, good.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is,
Sorry, what?
is.
Yeah, it comes up as 2B, which is number 2.
Okay.
Or B.
Would.
Would.
Would
37.
could you in a boat?
Yeah.
You, as in me and you.
You is number 18.
Been, like have been.
What we said, we meant bin. Bin does not come up because it's already
it's
there
like
as
is,
B.
'cause it's right.
It's to
Oh.
be. It's to be.
It's like to
I'll give you an extra life for that one. Have another try.
be. Oh, I get another try.
Oh, your friend.
You've given me
Yeah.
an extra life.
Ooh. Go? Maybe?
Go. Yeah, number 49.
What?
Think.
I think number 79.
Whew. That was close.
Now.
Now.
Yeah.
Hold on. Number 73.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
No. Okay.
Oh, first
Put on
one
the
out.
Sure.
Yeah, tomorrow is not there, unfortunately.
Okay.
When?
Okay, yeah, go. 51.
First.
Number 88.
We.
Number 27.
They.
They is number 26.
Me.
Me is number 50.
Us.
Us is number 100.
Ooh.
How.
How is number 85.
This is getting hard. Oh, come on, you read Hemingway.
Read.
Read is not in there, unfortunately.
And the
My
week I
goodness.
win is the week I don't get my story.
But you get bragging rights.
I get total bragging rights. So there, I took you down.
Actual Houston. Very good. I thought this is going to go on forever, this quiz, but it got very difficult very quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
did. It got real hard, real quick.
Okay,
Funny
so
thing is there's still 74 words,
Really?
which is kind of crazy. Yeah.
we're
We'll have to
we're not
send me
good
the
at
link to
these
that
list
list. I'm curious.
games. We know our weakness, list games. Okay. So, just a reminder, next week's story is Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor. To join the discussion, visit literaryroadhouse.com. While you're at it, leave an iTunes or Stitcher review and tell us which episode is your favorite. Your reviews encourage us and help others find our podcast. Don't forget to tell your friends. And until next time, read a good story.
Can you believe it? 10 episodes. We're in the 2 digits. Woo! Confetti!